Okay, let's talk about a war that lasted 45 years, reshaped the entire globe, and pushed humanity right to the brink of annihilation. But here's the twist. The two main enemies never fired a single shot at each other. This was the Cold War, a battle of ideas, of influence, and just pure nerve.
So, for almost half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in this really tense geopolitical struggle. So, how did this cold conflict even start? What did it really mean for the world? And, how did it all come to such a sudden, dramatic end? Let's dive in and find out.
You know what's fascinating? It's where the name Cold War even comes from. It was actually coined by the writer George Orwell before the conflict officially began. In a 1945 essay, he had this chilling prediction of a world living under the shadow of the atomic bomb, a world of powerful superstates locked in this permanent hostile peace. And wow, was he right.
So after the devastation of World War II, the old allies found themselves as the world's two remaining superpowers, but they had completely opposite visions for the future. On one side, you've got the United States and the West, all about democracy and free market capitalism. And on the other side, you have the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc, totally committed to a single-party state and communism. The stage was absolutely set for a global ideological showdown.
And this wasn't just a war of words. I mean, Europe was literally split in two. In a famous speech back in 1946, Winston Churchill gave this division a really powerful name, declaring that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. It separated the free democracies of the West from the Soviet-controlled states in the East.
So, let's take a look at the first moves, as this division started to harden into official policy and sparked the first major confrontation of this new era.
The American plan wasn't to go in and defeat the USSR in a hot war, but to contain its influence. They were driven by this fear that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would follow like dominoes. So the Truman Doctrine pledged aid to any nation resisting it. Then the Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe to make it stronger against Soviet influence. And finally, NATO was formed as a military alliance to counter the Soviet threat.
Okay, so in 1948, the first real test of this new reality came. The city of Berlin was divided, but it was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany. Stalin tried to force the Western powers out by just cutting off all road and rail access to West Berlin. In response, the Allies launched the staggering year-long airlift, flying in supplies around the clock. It was a huge logistical feat, and it was a major political victory for the West. With the battle lines drawn, the conflict then entered its most dangerous phase. It was marked by a terrifying arms race and a whole series of escalating crises that pushed the entire world right to the edge of annihilation. This competition really played out on two main fronts. First, the nuclear arms race, which just exploded onto the scene when the Soviets tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, years ahead of schedule. Then came the space race, kicking off when the USSR shocked the world by launching Sputnik in 1957. Each side was just desperate to prove its technological and ideological superiority. And this infamous declaration from the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev really captured the aggressive confidence of the era. Now, he later claimed he meant an economic victory, not a military one. But at the time, that phrase sent a chill of terror right through the West.
It's a terrifying question, isn't it? And the answer came just 6 years later, in what was the single most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. In October of 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered an unthinkable threat: Soviet nuclear missile sites being built in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. For 13 agonizing days, the world just held its breath as a tense naval blockade and secret negotiations worked to avert a full-scale nuclear war. After staring right into the abyss of nuclear war, both superpowers seemed to pull back a bit. They entered this complex new period, a mix of easing tensions, which we call détente, alongside these brutal indirect conflicts fought all across the globe. This whole period led to landmark arms control talks, like the SALT treaties, and more open diplomacy between Washington and Moscow. But this easing of tensions didn't mean the competition was over. Not at all. It had just shifted to new battlegrounds.
Yeah, because while the superpowers never fought directly, they fueled these devastating wars across the globe. They armed and funded opposing sides in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other conflicts. It cost millions of lives,
all without them ever firing a single shot at each other. And this, right here, reveals a fatal weakness. See, while the dynamic U.S. economy could handle the massive cost of the arms race, the inefficient, state-run Soviet system was slowly being crushed by it. All that military spending came at the direct expense of its own people, and it was setting the stage for an internal collapse.
This economic strain brought the Cold War into its final dramatic act, and this is where decades of tension would unravel with just shocking speed. So in the 1980s, the U.S. really ramped up the pressure under President Ronald Reagan. His direct challenge to the Soviet leader at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin was this powerful symbol of a renewed Western confidence against a system that it saw as fundamentally weak and oppressive. But the decisive change, it came from within the Soviet Union itself. The new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, he knew the system was failing. So he introduced these two radical reforms, perestroika to restructure the economy and glasnost for political openness. Now his goal was to save the Soviet system, but instead, he unintentionally opened the floodgates of revolution.
And this all led to that unforgettable climax. Empowered by Gorbachev's reforms, the people of Eastern Europe started protesting. And then the impossible happened. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the Cold War, was breached by crowds of ordinary citizens. In the weeks that followed, communist regimes just collapsed across Eastern Europe, one after another.
With its buffer zone of satellite states totally gone and its own internal problems mounting, the Soviet Union itself was about to come to a sudden and very final end. And just like that, only 2 years after the fall of the wall, it was over. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The very next day, the Soviet Union, the superpower that had challenged the West for 45 years, it simply ceased to exist. The end of the Cold War didn't just end a conflict, it completely redrew the map of Europe and Central Asia. It created 15 new independent countries from the ashes of the old Soviet Empire. So, what's the ultimate takeaway from all this? Well, the Cold War itself might be over, but its echoes are all around us. The military alliances it created, like NATO, are more relevant than ever. The borders it drew are still being contested. And that central rivalry between a democratic West and an authoritarian East, well, it continues to define the conflicts and power struggles of our time, proving that the past is never really past.